Hi, welcome. Thank you for coming. I want to welcome the trustees from Penn America and any Andover parents or alumni and all of our special guests. I am very happy to see all of you tonight because we're really interested in your input and your experience, and we want to hear from you in the Q&A. Our panel tonight will encourage a college campus environment that not only has rigorous debate, but also has tolerant views from different perspectives. You would think that is what is going on in college, but that's not what we've been reading in the news. John Palfrey has written a great book, Safe Spaces, Brave Spaces, and it goes way past all of the media hype. I invite you all to take a copy at the end. We're home with you tonight. As an Andover parent, I have had the opportunity to see how a diverse community can thrive. The Andover students are so bright, I've had to update my vocabulary, as well as my thinking, and I've also had to stay on my toes. My son tried to convince me that giving him a curfew is a microaggression. We would not be here tonight if it were not for Suzanne Nozzle. She is CEO of Penn America, as most of you know, and she has been working nonstop. She has been writing articles, she has been appearing on panels, and recently she has brought Penn to college campuses to mediate the very difficult conversations between faculty, administrators, and students. We are at a complex moment as it relates to freedom of speech and how to foster diverse, healthy communities. John and Suzanne are both at the forefront of this, and I want to thank them for co-hosting this event tonight. I would now like to introduce our moderator, Jason Bellini. Jason is the senior producer at the Wall Street Journal. He is also known for his video series, The Short Answer, which has been dealing with the crossfire on college campuses. Jason will introduce our other panelists, Michelle Minter and Jermel McClure. And now welcome our panelists and Jason tonight. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. First, I want to thank Penn America and Phillips Andover Academy for inviting me to give me the honor of leading this discussion tonight. And I'll introduce you to our distinguished panelists, starting with Michelle Minter. Now, Michelle is the Vice Provost of Institutional Equity and Diversity at Princeton University. She has the longest title of anyone at the university. Is that true?
That's true.
Okay, great. And we also have John Palfrey. He has a much shorter title. You're the headmaster at Andover, correct?
It's head of school we now use, but yes.
Head of school.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's three
all
words,
right.
not one. Yeah.
And he's the author of Safe Spaces, Brave Spaces, as we already heard, that deals with diversity and free expression in education. Jermel McClure was the president of the Student Association at Binghamton University, and he was ousted from that position after he committed the offense of graduating this year. Now you're also in the real world, and you're not on your parents' sofa, right? You're here in New York City, and what are you going to be doing?
I'm going to be working as a private banking analyst at JP Morgan.
Excellent, congratulations.
Thank you.
Welcome to the real world.
Very excited to be here.
And Suzanne Nozzle, CEO of Penn America, thank you again for having me here. I think most of you here know about Suzanne, but a little bit about her background. You were the Chief Operating Officer at Human Rights Watch, the Executive Director of Amnesty International, and during the first term of the Obama administration, worked for the U.S. mission to the United Nations, dealing with human rights, and that was among the things in your portfolio. So the way this is going to work, first we're going to ask everyone on the panel to say a few brief words, and then at the end of our discussion, we'll have about 30 minutes of Q&A. And what I'm going to say is we're hoping that you have some provocative questions. Michelle, in fact, put the onus on me. She said, let's not make this boring. Let's have some provocative questions. And that shouldn't be so hard because the subject itself certainly is one where we can have a spirited discussion. So, Michelle, I'm going to have you make a few remarks to begin with. And I'm going to read to you a quote that I read from your article in Inside Higher Ed. You said, "We should resist this dismissive depiction of college students." Why don't you put some context around that?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be part of this. My role includes initiatives related to diversity and inclusion, as well as overseeing bias, discrimination, harassment for the campus. So it's really community building that allows us to do what we think is important, which is reap the intellectual and social benefits of diversity. What we have found with student activists, and that quote was specifically talking about student activists, is that they are highly caricatured. Students are students. Some of them are more mature, some of them are less mature. But for the most part, they're pretty mature. So I've really felt it was important to resist the temptation to exaggerate what's going on campuses. And to encourage us to realize that these are really complicated issues. Students do need education about them, but frankly, we all need education about them. They're very, very nuanced, and there's a tremendous amount of heightened rhetoric around them. So I hope we can talk more about that.
Look forward to that. Jen Paul Free, you recently wrote a column for a lesser newspaper, the New York Times. We'll forgive you for that. You said in there that free expression and its close cousin, the right to assemble peaceably, do not mean that anyone can say anything to anybody at any time. That was really the core of your argument that you made to the New York Times. Allow you to make some brief remarks.
Thank you so much, Jason. If only the Wall Street Journal had run the things I submitted, then maybe another publication. But let me start first by thanking Tara for the great kindness of hosting this event. It's super fun to be here, and really it's a dream come true to be talking about this in this really beautiful space. So thank you, and to Suzanne and Victoria and your team. This is great, and co-panelists, fun to be here with you. That quote, is I think one way into this topic, which is to say, I think free expression is so crucial, but it's also not an absolute in this country or anywhere in the world. And I think it is something that we need to protect, and we need to foster, and we need to have robust debate on our campuses and in our republic. And also, there are other values that we have, and one of them happens to be equality and inclusion. And I think part of the reason that I was so interested in this topic and wrote this book was to say, I believe strongly that we can have both liberty and equality in America. And we can have both liberty and equality on our college campuses and in schools like the one I run. But I think right now, the way we've been framing the debate has been pitting those two values against one another. Now, sometimes they aren't in conflict, and we will find those places and those conflicts. But I think actually our job, in a way, as educators, and whether it's on a college or university campus, or it's actually as a student leader or running an organization, is to find the way in which diversity actually thrives. And I think that diversity is actually in part about multiple forms of speech. And so I think ultimately they are some values that can coexist, but right now they've felt at odds to one another.
Jermel, a quote from you. You said, this is why you're a student, you said that every day questions arise about what is permitted and prohibited and the protection of speech rights. Every day those topics were coming up.
Definitely. I feel that, especially on a college campus, there are always different sort of affinity groups that are run by students, and so the students are always having conversations about different things that are happening in popular culture. And in popular culture, there's a constant conflict of ideas and values, and so it's important that the conversations like this conversation we're having today are constantly being had on university campuses, because it's important that students understand the differences, and they understand really what free speech is and why it's so important that it exists and why we don't necessarily suppress it.
All right. Suzanne, you're working on these issues day in, day out. What's top of mind with you right now?
It's interesting. I think there are threats on both sides. I mean, just very briefly in terms of PEN America's work, we began with a report, and there are copies of it outside, called In Campus for All, Diversity, Inclusion, and Free Speech at U.S. Universities, where we really tried to give both sides of this debate their due. We looked across all the issues, microaggressions, safe spaces, disinvitations to campus speakers, and examined very clearly what arguments were being advanced by each side of the argument, and tried to weigh them up. We put out a set of PEN America principles on campus speech that set out how we believe these issues should be approached. And then we've gone out over the last year to 4 of the sites of the most kind of pitched, heated controversies around the country. So the University of California at Berkeley, Middlebury College in Vermont, College Park, Maryland, university there, and finally UVA, Charlottesville. And just to kind of frame it briefly, there are threats on both sides. Let's take University of California, Berkeley, where there was a very highly publicized set of incidents that occurred when Milo Yiannopoulos wanted to come to campus, and they put very stringent restrictions on where and when and how he could speak, to the point where the event essentially could not move forward. It was canceled. There's a lawsuit now underway. And one of the things we heard in this kind of closed-door symposium, where we had the provost of the university, we had student leaders, we had First Amendment experts from the law school there, faculty members. We heard from conservative students, the college Republicans, saying, what brought them to this, wanting to mount this free, so-called Free Speech Week and bring some of the most provocative and controversial speakers from around the country to campus, was a sense of marginalization, a sense that their ideas were being shut out, shunted to the side, that they couldn't get faculty advisors for their student organizations, they couldn't book rooms on campus, because in order to book a room there, you have to have a partner that's an academic department in certain cases, and no departments would partner with them. And they got fed up. They were sort of pushed to their limit, and they knew that being at a public university, they had the right to invite who they wanted, and they went, they went to the edge and wanted to push those buttons. And there were even students of color in the room who said, actually here at Berkeley, they have a point. It's just a very left-leaning campus. It's it's a very diverse student body. They have a diverse faculty. They have a lot of support for students of color. And a lot of terrific things. They're really kind of far ahead of the curve, I think, when it comes to embracing and realizing diversity and inclusion on campus. And yet there's this problem of ideological diversity that they, are now trying to address. And I think they're approaching it very well. Now they have new leadership, and they've changed their policies in terms of time, place, and manner, so that these speakers can come, and they've recognized that some of these hurdles are probably inconsistent with the law and not the right approach on campus. And then you have the opposite situation in a place like Middlebury, where Charles Murray was invited to speak by a conservative student group, and he was shouted down. It was impossible for the speech to go forward. They had to sequester him kind of in an upstairs room to deliver his speech via audio. And then when he left, he left the building, he and a professor were assaulted, and she was physically injured, suffered a concussion. Their car, people were on top of their car, wouldn't let them leave. It was a terrifying situation, and the students really were barely disciplined for that. And I think there was a sense on campus. We heard a lot about this. It's the whitest state in the union. There's a very small minority population at Middlebury. It's a kind of jock-oriented culture there. I mean, it's a wonderful school, but it's a very kind of close and insular environment. And I think for students of color, it has not been the most comfortable situation. And when something that felt very uncomfortable came into their midst, the reaction was explosive. And the university in the aftermath, I think, felt really constrained in terms of how to deal with this. And I think ultimately, the punishment and the approach meted out, was less than it should have been. So, just to outline kind of some of the threats to speech from both sides that are really on the table here, and these difficult questions of how we reconcile them.
Suzanne, in bringing up Charles Murray, I thought of a potentially provocative question here. I'm going to give it some provocative framing ripped from the headlines. Here's my question. Should there be a zero tolerance policy towards students who are blocking, impeding invited guests onto campuses? They probably don't want to call it that. Anyone who wants to take that one?
I'll start.
Please.
First of all, we had Charles Murray come to Princeton a couple months before he went to Middlebury. There was a protest, but it went perfectly fine. He delivered his remarks, the students protested, everybody got to exercise their free speech. And our policy on our campus would be, we don't allow for that sort of heckler's veto. We have administrators at all of our programs. We call them free expression monitors. Their job is to protect the rights of everyone, which includes both the speakers and those who want to demonstrate. So it's very important to us that students be able to demonstrate if they want, but they cannot use a heckler's veto. They cannot shut down the speech. That would be not according to our policies, and we would certainly never tolerate violence. On our campus, there would definitely be discipline if there was violence involved. But we also believe that they should have a right to go pretty far in expressing their displeasure. But we also would not allow them to cancel a speaker.
Fair enough. Jamel, have you had any incidents in your experience on campus where you felt like students might have been going too far?
I don't think students have gone too far because there hasn't been an instance in which someone's gotten hurt like the situation that happened at Middlebury. But I definitely believe that their right to protest should definitely be protected by the university. And I mean, there could be a sort of a productive way to go about doing that. So like what happened at Princeton, the sort of speaker who's been invited by a specific group of students should definitely have their right to speak, and those students or participants who would like to participate in that should definitely do that. But those students who feel conflicted about that and who feel sort of that that's bringing an unsafe environment to campus or unsafe views for them to campus should definitely have the right to protest, and they should be able to do that with the support of the university.
Suzanne, what's your take on hecklers?
You know, I think where it gets, I agree with everything that's been said. I think sometimes you can get into kind of a challenging line drawing exercise. You know, what is a reasonable disruption? If it's inside the room, you know, that should be permissible at a certain level. And some people have mounted very creative and effective protests, you know, that are silent. They turn their back, they walk out, they have signs, but they don't interfere with somebody's ability to continue with their speech and with the ability of the listeners to hear from the person they want to hear from. You know, I think a few minutes disruption is probably permissible and acceptable, but that at a certain point it needs to subside or it's trumping over other speech and infringing on speech. You know, one thing, you know, the effort to, you know, and it sounds like, I mean, the free speech monitors is an interesting approach. There's now a move now in many states, in about 17 states, to introduce legislation, this piece of model legislation that's being introduced to try to ensure punishments for students who interfere with speech. And the problem with that is, you know, the vagueness of the definition and what really is entailed in terms of interfering with the expressive rights of others. Is 5 minutes an interference? You know, is shouting out or shouting over someone briefly an interference? So I do worry about kind of heavy-handed efforts to police this, and particularly on the part of legislatures. I think the better approach is the universities doing kind of, as Michelle said, and really taking a proactive approach to ensuring that expressive rights on both sides are upheld.
John, a question for you. This one's also ripped from the headlines. Bias prevention policies. You may have seen that the Justice Department said this month they filed a statement of interest with federal court related to Michigan State, University of Michigan rather, saying that that school's bias response policy violates the First Amendment by punishing students for offenses as minor as hurting their classmates' feelings. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, I think it's a really good example because I think it does situate us at the intersection between what we're seeking to do relative to making these communities more inclusive and the rights that we need to continue to protect around free expression. So it's a great example in this particular way. University of Michigan also would be interesting insofar as it's a state university or has predominantly a state university. It's complicated because it has some private funding too, and so forth. That it sets it a little bit apart also from some of our other institutions that are private, and that's actually an important distinction. I think the basic idea, though, helps us to see the fact that these two things can come in conflict with a particular policy. So I'm going to punt a little in saying it is a line drawing exercise in the sense that we do need to be able to have policies that prevent certain kinds of bias, and hate speech would be in that zone. On the other hand, you also need to be able to ensure that students can say things that are maybe politically offensive, and there are things that are going to hurt feelings. And so it would really, to my mind, come down to what that policy was, and to what extent were you actually disallowing the kinds of speech on our campus to go forward that we need to allow, and to what extent is it a process of trying to ensure that everybody has their ability to speak.
But is it the role of university administrators to protect the feelings of students?
Well, it is, in one sense it is, which is at a broad level. I think it's crucial for us to say these are learning environments where people are coming at a young age, and they have been predominantly white institutions, and that for some people coming into these environments is a challenge for a variety of cultural reasons. So yes, I feel as an administrator that the feelings of our students is relevant to their ability to learn. Now, how far that goes, and you will get quickly to a microaggression conversation potentially, or other related ones as to what's a permissible overstep of those things. But yes, I'm concerned about, let's take feelings as a word that might evoke laughter, and put social and emotional learning relative to cognitive learning. Yes, I'm concerned about social and emotional learning of kids.
Other thoughts?
I think the challenge that the DOJ made to this policy is really on the basis that the criteria for defining an incident that could constitute bias was solely kind of the subjective feelings of somebody on the receiving end. And I think John's right. Feelings matter, and I think administrators should think about students' feelings. That doesn't mean somebody's subjective feeling of being hurt should necessarily form the basis for a civil rights investigation. I think that's where it goes too far. We do have under the law well-established definitions of harassment and discrimination, that I think, properly applied should take care of that and do provide us with the line in terms of what, these public universities need to uphold in terms of creating an environment that is equal and inclusive for all students. And when they're asked to sort of go beyond that, I think that's the concern in this Michigan case, that they're being asked to consider, a level of offense that doesn't rise to the level of harassment or discrimination under the law, but that nonetheless, is concerning. And yes, it's concerning, but is it grounds to silence or punish speech? I think, and my feeling is not. I haven't heard much criticism of the legal definition of harassment or discrimination. I think it, does a decent job. I mean, I'd be interested in Michelle's views, but whether we need to change those definitions legally, or whether we can rest on those definitions and say, that really is the dividing line in terms of speech that is, can be banished or suppressed.
Yeah, we use the legal definitions basically in our policies of harassment, which requires that the behavior, just to quote them more or less, is that the behavior be severe or pervasive enough to be significantly undermining the educational experience. So that's a pretty high bar. That's not, I didn't like your comment. It has to be severe or pervasive enough to impact the educational experience in a meaningful way. Using a reasonable person's standard. So it's not just your feelings. So there's actually quite a lot to that. And that's the way we apply it. So there's a lot of room for people to be uncomfortable with what they encounter where it wouldn't meet our policy or the law's definition of harassment. I think that this is one of the spaces where there's been a lot of criticism in the media over sort of the notion of bias response as being a way for students to be encouraged to report every slight that they experience. That's not the way we treat it on our campus. I think when it deteriorates to that level, where the faculty feel policed in some ways, or students feel policed, it's just not very productive. I think we have to be both recognizing that something can feel harmful without saying that that's something that requires discipline. And we do that all the time.
Can you repeat again what that bar is? Where's that line?
It's to meet, for our policy, which is very close to the law, to be harassment, it needs to be severe or pervasive enough to significantly interfere with the educational experience by the standard of a reasonable person.
So for a reasonable person, if a professor were to, in teaching a course about pornography and race, if that professor were to use the N-word in a context of making an argument, would that be pervasive, or would that meet that standard? And you can explain what I'm. You can tell the story behind
Yeah,
what I'm
randomly
talking about
chose an
here.
example that we had at Princeton this year. So we had an anthropology class on free speech and pornography and blasphemies. I think that was
Hate
the topic.
speech,
Yeah.
blasphemy, pornography.
Right.
Sounds like a fun class.
In the very first class, in the first half an hour, the professor used the N-word a number of times. This is a white professor. There was a great deal of student confusion and distress. Sort of questioning why are you using the term? And we got some calls afterwards from students saying, I'm very distressed, I don't know what's going on, is this okay? Princeton very strongly said, yes, professors have the right to choose the language that professors get to choose how they handle their classrooms. But, we would have looked, because free speech is important on our campus, but if there had been a very, very consistent pattern of this for reasons that had nothing to do with the topic of the class, we might have seen it differently. Now, the class was on hate speech.
And it was canceled.
Right, but I would stress the university strongly backed the professor, but we also listened to the students' concerns. Said, we hear you, we understand why that was really uncomfortable. The professor made the decision to cancel the class without any encouragement from the administration. We did not encourage him to do that, but he realized that his pedagogical strategy of trying to be provocative to get their attention had failed, and that he'd sort of lost the trust of the students. I believe that if he had done more context setting, if he had spent more time developing that trust, this is a class on hate speech. I think they could have had this conversation, but not in the first 20 minutes of the first class. That was just a little, I just think it was too much. And they didn't know him, and they didn't know how to interpret this. Interestingly, the students in the class, the very same ones who were expressing distress, were also distressed that the class got canceled. So
Okay.
it wasn't their goal to silence him, it was their goal to say, we don't understand, we want to have a conversation so that he understands why we're struggling with this. And sort of revisit whether this is really necessary.
Yet they took it to the level of administrators.
Yeah.
I mean, instead of having a conversation with the professor or in the classroom about that.
Oh, well,
wouldn't
they did have a very long conversation with the professor in the classroom, at the end of which there seemed to be no mutual understanding, which is why they left the class and sort of went roaming around campus looking for people to talk to about their experience. So we listened. But we were very clear that, professors get to make those kind of decisions. Those are academic decisions, albeit one that had clearly gone awry, and he figured that out. The one other thing I will say about it was that both sides were sort of using their free speech. The students were distressed, and they expressed that. The professor was making pedagogical choices, and he had the right to do that. The media was very quick on both sides of the spectrum to label him a racist and the students snowflakes. I don't think that was really what was happening in either case. I think it was way more nuanced than that. And both sides got a tremendous amount of really harassing and disturbing social media attention, from people writing to them and calling and behaving in ways where I think, that sort of use of free speech, I think, is really problematic and disturbing.
But the reverberation of something like this, I wonder whether professors all over the country read about a controversy like this, and the lesson they take away is, I better be careful what I say. Are incidents like this having a silencing effect?
Yeah. So I think that rather than having a silencing effect, these incidents just remind professors or anyone who's in a leadership position, a position of power, to be just more mindful about what they're saying. And I think that that's so important. It's so important to really understand your audience, understand the message that you're trying to convey, and just be mindful in the way you're going about conveying that message. Because, you know, you don't necessarily have to say a specific word to convey a message, especially if that trust hasn't been built. And if you are sort of told by the students, hey, this makes me feel uncomfortable, I think the response should automatically be, I didn't mean to make you feel uncomfortable. Let's figure out a way to still have this conversation, but without making you feel cringeworthy or without making you feel unsafe, unless the intention was to do that. And so I think that a lot of the times it's those honest conversations after something has happened in which, you know, one side has said something that has offended the other, that when you can have that conversation at the point of conflict or right after the point of conflict and there hasn't really been malice intended, then it's important to sort of acknowledge that. But when there's sort of a hardline defense of the problematic or of the harmful comment that was made, that's when students start to feel uncomfortable, and that's when I think, you know, the clash is a little bit too much.
Well, John, do you think that some teachers at your institution or around the country are becoming scared of their students?
I hope not. That would be a very, very sad outcome. I would say that this particular case at Princeton became a hypothetical or not so hypothetical case used in a moot court by some teachers with some students to talk about this issue. So it actually was itself very productive in an interesting way, right? Painful for the students in that class, painful for that professor, but actually helped to provoke, you know, what was, you know, can one use the N-word in a classroom at Andover as an example, and how and when would that be acceptable or not? So absolutely, I think it's been productive in that way. One thing I would note, though, is that this is not so new. In preparation for this, I've been reading the Philip Roth book, The Human Stain, that won the Penn-Faulkner Award, I believe, which is exactly on this topic about a professor saying something he shouldn't have said to some students, having it out of context, in his view, getting fired for it, and so forth. So this, I do think that this is something that, at least for the last few decades, teachers have been thinking about. I wouldn't say scared of their students. I would say that there is there's a concern about PC police and the idea that the academic freedom is being undermined to a degree. We haven't particularly had somebody at Andover tripped up over that as a teacher, so I wouldn't say people are afraid in a literal sense, but it's a topic.
Suzanne?
Yeah, I have one more comment. I think also that sort of the, I guess, uprise in students being more vocal about the way they feel about whatever content is being sort of taught in the classroom is super important. I think students have to feel empowered to express their views on the language that their professors or their teachers are using, simply because if they do feel too uncomfortable or if they do feel like they can't express themselves, and I think that does hinder the learning that can happen within the classroom. If they don't feel comfortable enough to be honest and saying, hey, this made me feel a little bit, made me feel some type of a way, or hey, this made me feel uncomfortable, then they may sort of shut down and become closed to a really great learning opportunity.
I totally agree with that, but I do worry about sort of self-censorship, and I think, it's absolutely Phillips Roth, and we see it kind of accelerated, I think, now, on certain topics, whether it's affirmative action, Me Too, and, this sort of due process issues in that, say the Israel-Palestine conflict, I think is one of the best examples. There are a lot of things you could say that we might kind of agree, are on a reasonable spectrum opinion. They're certainly not hateful speech, which, even that is protected under the First Amendment, of course, but, things that are well outside that category that nonetheless, I think, particularly in the age of social media, where it can be captured on video, a soundbite can be extricated, can go viral around the world, that, and people have gotten fired. Somebody, a university administrator who said to a student of color, you are, not the normal, peg that fits into the hole here. So we want to make these special efforts to, welcome you or accommodate you. That was sort of taken out of context, and the person had to resign. I mean, it became the subject of protests, and I think it was, it was not someone who had a history or track record of being insensitive to those issues. It was just a really badly worded statement that was made, that struck a particular student, in a certain way, and it spiraled out. And there are incidents like that. I think, you sort of brought into it, what is the intent? And, if the intent is pedagogical and the intent is not to offend, can we then find some common ground? But in some instances, I mean, one of the arguments we've heard is, kind of own your impact. So it's sort of like what I call like a strict liability for speech. If you say the wrong thing and it strikes someone in a negative, harmful way, that's the end of the story. And what you meant by it, what your intent was, doesn't really come into it because that subjective experience, is what needs to come first. I think we should recognize the subjective experience, but I think that's a very problematic standard to impose, and that it is chilling. I mean, if you know that that's the system we're operating under, I think you have to be extremely careful. I think there's a level of conscientiousness that I think is necessary and appropriate, but I also do think, particularly because of social media and the potential for things to be taken out of context, to reverberate so widely, and to be housed on the internet forever. So that professor's going to be forever known for this N-word incident. He's never going to,
Yeah, in his obituary, it's going to say that.
Now, never Google him without that coming up, and so he has to live with that. And I think, maybe in this case it's arguable, but I think there are a lot of other things you could say where, having that kind of lasting impact on your career and your life, really wouldn't be warranted.
What if Princeton sent out a letter to incoming freshmen that said, you are not going to be protected from microaggressions and from things that may offend you. You're here to learn. I'm referring to, if you'll be able to correct me on this, if I recall correctly, it was University of Chicago that sent a letter using with that kind of a message, telling students, all right, this is, we're basically saying, don't get offended. This is about learning here. They set a tone. Do you think that was a smart move? Could something like that have prevented what happened here?
Well, we wouldn't have sent a letter like that. And it doesn't mean that we don't agree with the fundamental belief that freedom of expression is very important. We actually, the University of Chicago has a freedom of expression statement that Princeton adopted. So that we have actually a very similar point of view on the importance of freedom of expression. But to me, that letter was a failure of inclusivity. Because you want to do both. To have your first message to your students who have not yet arrived be, you need to understand you are not safe here, you need to feel uncomfortable here, which was the way that message came across. And it wasn't a well-worded letter. I think that was one of the challenges with it. Although he meant it.
It was clear.
It was clear. We wouldn't have sent a message that said the most important thing that we need to tell you is that you will not be safe on our campus.
That's not exactly what it said.
I know, I'm slightly exaggerating. But he said there are no safe spaces on this campus. And he meant intellectual spaces.
Yes.
We would agree with that. We want an education to be an intellectually risky experience. But we do want people to feel that they are safe and it can have a degree of feeling that they belong on our campus. So we would have chosen a different way to express perhaps some of the same sentiments. We wouldn't have used the word safe. I'm sure of that. We would have avoided that.
Do you feel, your institution, you have younger students.
We do, and it's sort of a wonderful thing in one sense, which is every year you have to write that letter. Like, what's the letter you first ball in to your new students? What do you say? And actually, one of the things that was great about this particular letter, which I agree was ham-handed, and I use it as an example in this book of where I think, in some ways, the expression was not well handled. I completely agree, by the way, with the University of Chicago's underlying principles, for a university. But what it highlighted, I think, is what are you trying to say to your students about the kind of environment that you're inviting them into? And for a lot of students, that's an attractive message, actually. There are kids, no doubt, who are choosing University of Chicago because of that message, right? Mm-hmm. And so on some level, it's a helpful thing. It's an acknowledgement. This is where we will fall in this particular debate. Now, again, I think for Andover, we would write a different message, which would be something that made the case before, that I think there do need to be some safe spaces on campuses. I can talk about why that's so. And the overall environment, a classroom should be a brave space, and it's going to be a place where you will be uncomfortable. And yes, it's a little different going for 14 to 18-year-old than being 19 to 22 in the university setting, and absolutely there are going to be more constraints, you know, in a 14-year-old's dorm than there are going to be in a law school classroom, right? And that's appropriate. But I think it's a wonderful, that letter is also a really good sort of discussion point for just these reasons.
I'm wondering is some of the terminology that's much derided in popular culture now from some people on the left. You hear Bill Maher making fun of safe spaces and microaggressions. It seems to me if you're saying, okay, we are going to have safe spaces on campus, that suggests, well, there are places where you're unsafe, and that there are ideas and there are people who hold those ideas that are unsafe. Is this helpful language to use to call us to have safe spaces at all?
I don't think unsafe is a particularly useful term. That's why I prefer brave spaces in this particular
right.
setting. I mean, I do think part of education at any age is being uncomfortable. That is part of what's happening, and I think that's for all students. Where safe space is a useful term, and actually one of the really interesting things, I'd be interested in Jamel's take on this, I have found that students think about the word safety really differently than I do. So I think when safety on campus, I think of like vans that come along to pick you up at night so you're carefully conveyed from one place to the other and you won't be physically harmed. Students have a very different sense of what it means to be safe on a campus. And I was tripped up on this my first several years at Andover because I didn't have any idea what they were talking about in terms of that kind of safety. But I do think on our campuses, we should have spaces that are like a kitchen. Like you should be able, particularly in a boarding environment for a young person, to be able to retreat to a place where you can say some dumb stuff with some people around you, and you will know that that's not going to be recorded and then put out on the internet, just as we do in our own kitchens at our home. And I think for some students at some ages, this kind of space is important. Suzanne and I were talking about how most people don't debate that you should have Hillels on campus, or you could have LGBTQ spaces on campus. Those are the safe spaces I think we should have, and we should have brave spaces broadly, which are the places where kids are going to get
Kitchen is stressed. almost kind of the opposite, but, you know, a place where you can say something stupid is actually, you know, that's like your safe space and his unsafe space, because I might say something, you know, that's racially offensive, and, you know, for me, I was just letting off steam, or I didn't know, and I'm not aware, and I come from a town in the Midwest where I've never interacted with people from other backgrounds, you know, so I blunder into something, and I've made his kitchen unsafe. So I think that's one of the problems with the concept, is that sort of, you know, one person's safety may be another person's real discomfort.
Maybe we have different kitchens. I don't know.
I think that safe spaces are super important, and I believe that when it comes to a safe space, it's a space where these ideas or the ideals of whatever group are protected, as far as, you know, there isn't going to be a specific sort of agitator. The conversations that are had within those spaces aren't going to be very contentious conversations about whatever identity really belongs to that space. And I think that in a safe space, there's often sort of instances in which someone says something that is a little bit, you know, offensive, but they can be corrected in that space, and they can understand, you know what, I'm sorry for saying that here. I didn't mean to offend you in that way. I recognize that this is a safe space, and so I won't say things that were provocative in that way in this sort of a forum. Because a brave space, like a classroom, is a space in which we'll have that sort of conflict, and that conflict will be invited. Whereas in these other spaces, you know, it's really important that people have a place that they can retreat to. They understand that in this area, everyone respects my identity. In this area, if I am offended, because, you know, in conversation, that's naturally going to happen. But if that does happen, there'll be a respectful sort of interaction. Mm-hmm. And I think that at a point like now, when we're having, you know, such heightened awareness when it comes to mental health, safe spaces are even more important, because those are spaces where people can go and they can talk about what they're going through and sort of kind of share a common identity.
Well, I have a question for you about safe spaces. Who sort of defines the parameters of that? And, you know, is it self-governed? I mean, is it a space where students come together and, you know, we say we're all Bernie supporters, or we're all the Christian Fellowship, or, you know, we're Students for Justice in Palestine, you know, and we sort of decide what's the permissible range of conversation in our group? Or do you see it as, do you see a role for the university in defining, what's in and out of bounds in a safe space?
Yeah, so I definitely think that the role of the university is to provide the facility. So definitely to provide the facility, and that's pretty much about it. I think after that, it definitely becomes more communal, right? You decide where you're gonna draw the line in this space. And it's important to be very honest about that. In this room or in this clubhouse, we're not gonna have conversations about these things because we believe that those are offensive to the people who belong to this group. Or we believe that those things could sort of cause a discomfort in a way that we don't want to sort of have in this area. I think that if a university was to do it, it could become a little bit contentious because then students are going to say, hey, you're sort of trying to police our spaces. Whereas as a community, you can decide, hey, I don't really believe that comment you made was appropriate. Let's not have conversations like that, or let's not make comments like that in this area.
But doesn't a safe space, couldn't it be interpreted, particularly by conservative students, to mean this is a space where you're not welcome, where your views are not welcome? Isn't that what it's come to represent to many people?
Yes, to some degree that's true, although it varies, right? So, the conservative Christian groups have spaces.
They have their own safe spaces? Do they call them that?
They don't call them that, but that's what they are. I mean,
Okay.
and of course, remember, on a predominantly white college campus, most of the campus is safe for white students, right? It's that's just that most of the spaces were designed around making sure that they were able to thrive. But in fact, I think there are all kinds of settings in which students gather with others who share primarily their identity and work together as a community. We only call some of them safe spaces around certain kinds of identities. So multicultural centers and LGBT centers and women's centers tend to be labeled as the safe spaces. But in fact, the Campus Republican Club and the Christian Union are also safe spaces for different kinds of populations. So we just need to recognize that there are a lot of and sports teams can in fact be, the lacrosse team is probably a safe space for a group of students. These identity-based spaces, they're all over campuses, and they're really important to having a sense of belonging.
Freedom of association,
Yeah.
and that's sort of, those are basic rights that people have to be with, the people they choose to spend time with. And I basically agree with you. I think the problem comes in when the university is in the position of trying to impose or enforce it, and when it kind of takes over big spaces, like the whole dining hall, or the whole residential college is a safe space, or the whole campus, is a safe space, that excludes certain ideas. I think that's a real problem. I think the idea that there are going to be nodes of all kinds that people voluntarily enter into and self-police, that's just freedom of association. I don't like the term safe spaces because, to me, it sort of conflates physical and psychological safety in a problematic way. And there are people who argue that, speech can be violence. And I reject that idea because I think if you accept that speech in of itself can constitute violence, then speech can justify a violent reaction. I think that's how you end up in the Middlebury situation. If Charles Murray's speech you consider violence, then if you punched him in the nose, you've been provoked and that may be justified. So I think, to me it's a problematic term. We may have lost that battle because I think for your generation, it's a term that people are pretty wedded to. And, we may be on stronger ground trying to make sure it's defined simply as freedom of association and that it doesn't become grounds to sort of police much larger spaces and in an institutional way.
In my day, we called them clubs. I was a member of the LGBT club,
Right.
and that felt safe to me. But
that's what we're really talking about.
Yeah,
Yes.
and I think that, a safe space isn't sort of telling people, hey, if you don't belong to this group or if you don't sort of share this common morals, you can't come here. But what I do believe it does is say, hey, in this space, be respectful of the folks who sort of have ownership over this space. And when they say, don't say that, or we're not going to have those sorts of conversations, respectfully say, I understand that. We don't have to have that conversation here. We could have it outside in the brave space. And we can sort of have whatever conversations or whatever sort of discussion you want to have in this space that makes you feel comfortable.
So now, if you'll indulge me, I want to ask all of you what I think is a challenging question. And I'm actually going to read it because I put some thought into this, into the wording of this. It's a do you agree or disagree question with this statement. Here's the statement. Not my statement, I'm just putting it out there. Conservative speakers are sometimes tarred unfairly as prejudiced, fascist, or white supremacists. That You see where I'm going with this? Do you agree that that's happening?
Sometimes, sure.
Yeah, I
Absolutely,
agree.
without a question. And, I do think that one of the things we're not great at, particularly on our elite kind of coastal universities, is I think we are very, very left-leaning. I don't think we balance political perspectives well at all in terms of presenting to kids a variety of serious viewpoints. And I think very often, and I am roughly speaking in this category of people on the left as teachers, I think we are quick to dismiss someone's point of view that is actually much more worthy than we're giving it credit for.
Suzanne, what do you think?
Didn't I write that statement? I said something very close to that in the piece I wrote. I definitely agree. I think, you listen to some of these conservative speakers that people get, very upset about. And, it's a lot of questions you can ask about Murray. Are you judging, whether your reaction coming to campus is what he's going to speak about? Is it his most recent book? Is it his whole body of work? Is that sort of all on the table anytime he shows up? One of the arguments that the people who invited him made is, that's not what he was going to talk about. If you actually heard his talk, there was nothing problematic about it. So, then there are other conservative speakers, who may have some controversial ideas, but there is a sort of propensity, and I think social media kind of encourages us to lump people together, to dismiss, to have guilt by association. If someone, once, agreed with someone else, they become tarred by all of their ideas. So I think the nuance gets lost in that, there really is that risk.
Michelle, another question for you. You're the one who told me ask provocative questions.
I'm all for it. Let's do it.
All right. Let's talk about so-called microaggressions. And John, you said we were going to probably get to that. Well, here we are. So in terms of debates over campus free speech, so a few years ago you wrote, this is in your commentary for Inside Higher Ed, that small slights, often labeled as microaggressions, are common and have lasting effects. So it sounded sympathetic towards the concept of microaggressions. And I read some of the comments, which you should never read the comments, but I read the comments. But one commenter said, microaggressions is just the latest excuse to shut other people up. If that commenter were here, how would you respond?
Yeah, well, I just to explain it so that everyone understands what microaggressions are, they are comments which are made typically not intentionally, in order to, which are perceived in a way which somebody perceives negatively based on their identity. And although the term is thrown around to mean a whole lot of things, so that's one of the challenges. This is
Sandra was not talking about a real microaggression.
Right, that was not a microaggression to have her son have a
It was funny though.
But it is a term that's used very broadly for things that people are uncomfortable with, don't like, but really it is intended to refer to kind of small unintentional slights. It doesn't mean that they can't have real, that they can't actually be disconcerting and upsetting, particularly if you're subject to them quite often, which some people are. You can, my husband, who's Asian American, regularly has people ask him where he's from, and he says, I'm from New Jersey, and they say, where are you really from? And what they mean is, he looks like a foreigner to them, even though he was born in New Jersey. Well, that gets old after a while, right? That just gets old, that somebody constantly assumes you're a foreigner. But on the other hand, so I think for people to become aware that those things can have effect, particularly over time, is important. People need to understand those things. But they're not intentional. No one's trying to insult my husband by asking that question. They're trying to ask, they're trying to engage him. They're just doing it from whatever presumptions they bring.
In my day, you know what we called microaggressions in my day? Being a jerk.
Yeah, that's right, right? Some of it is being a jerk. Some of it is well-intentioned and just, ignorant. We are very clear that a microaggression is never going to get someone disciplined on our campus. That is not going to meet the bar of severe or pervasive. It's just not going to meet that bar. So we try and help students think through the fact that it's disconcerting and frustrating. We try and help them think about whether they can ask or comment back to the person and say, why are you asking me that? Or what is your comment really about? Or I just want to point out how that hit me, or so on. But we try and draw a really clear line between things that have intent and things that are people trying to engage with other people. And if someone who asks a question with good intention gets shut down and feels like, oh wow, I should never ask a question, I should never comment on that, that's not good either. So we need to kind of create a space where there's just more willingness to assume good intent, but it's hard.
John, how do you deal with microaggressions on your campus?
Well, I agree with what Michelle said, and we certainly treat them the same way, which is to say that this is something I had to learn about. I have not experienced a whole lot of microaggressions in my life for a variety of reasons. It was not something that was apparent to me as a concern, but certainly for a number of our faculty and for a number of our students, it is an issue. And I think part of the way in which it's been explained to me is that for some people, you are subject to microaggressions on one aspect of your identity, and for others, it gets doubled up or tripled up, and it just gets exhausting. And it's a pain, and people are a jerk to you more often than to other people. So I would say the same thing that Michelle did, which is I could never imagine a microaggression leading to a disciplinary response. I could imagine it leading into a conversation about don't be a jerk, right? And to take your point, which is, this may have had an impact on somebody that you didn't intend at all. And we talk a lot about the intent-impact dichotomy in terms of comments. And in an educational setting, the answer to that should be, let's think about how that was understood, and can we improve the strength of our community. But it should not be formal. It should be as effective and quiet as it can be, and as sort of human as it can be.
Do you think it's helpful to the campus to have it part of the vernacular on campus?
I think for some people, there's no question it overstates something that it's just a slight, and we shouldn't use this other term. For others, it puts a name to something that they've experienced on a campus over and over and over again. So I would say, on balance, I think it's a helpful thing to have it as a concept. I think absolutely an institutional response to it can go way too far. And I think it's a little bit like what Jermel was saying about safe spaces, which is, I think it needs to be about humans getting along and learning to get along, as opposed to the institution having a heavy-handed approach to enforcing a particular space or set of rules in that way. And that's where the challenge lies, I think.
So we're about to send a microphone around for questions, but one last thing from Jermel, I would ask you on your campus. Did students actually use the term microaggression? You microaggressioned me? How did people, is that said?
Yeah, we definitely used it, and I would like to just expand upon a sentiment you just made. Basically, it allows a name, it puts a name to something that is experienced very commonly. And I think that it's a very simple conversation to have. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult, but hey, that was a microaggression. And like you said before, oftentimes people don't know that they're making or committing microaggressions, but it's really helpful to be able to identify what just happened and to have, you could even leave it at that, hey, that was a microaggression. The person who made the comment would understand that was a little bit off kilter, I shouldn't make comments like that anymore. And the person who's been sort of offended by the comment is able to express the way they felt without having a very long, drawn out, maybe awkward conversation about what just happened.
Okay, well, I think it's time for some questions, but I think one thing we should establish before the questions begin, you can help me with this. Is this a brave space or a safe space?
Oh, I think
we'll find out. All right,
it should be a brave space.
A brave space.
All right, well, this is a brave space. Who has a brave question? Sir, right here. Well, wait for the microphone, please. Oh, him right there. Right there behind you. Oh, we'll come to you next. There's time for everyone. There's time for everyone. Sir.
So I'd like to go back to the outside person coming to the campus and speaking, and how the university or the school, in one way or another, polices that. It seems to me the first issue is there something illegal about the speech? And so I speak of this from my perspective as a most protection. What are the administrators of those talks? Where are they drawing the line between what's safe and what's not safe, what's permitted and what's not permitted? And are you ejecting people who are interfering with the ability of the speaker to speak?
Well, I could start with that, and then Suzanne, maybe you wanted to comment. Different campuses have slightly different attitudes about this, but our position is we encourage our students, and we're a private university, so we do not have to allow speakers to rent the space. They have to be invited by someone on campus. We would never disinvite someone once they've been invited. We would, if we had to do a lot to make sure that the speaker could speak, because there were risks of counter-protests, we would do that. But we do a lot of work up front to encourage people to think about why they are inviting speakers and whether those speakers are intended to just be provocative or whether there is real intellectual merit and how they're going to be received on the campus where we care about trying to create an inclusive environment, albeit one where people are faced with discomfort around ideas. So we would do a lot of work up front to make sure that the invitation was well thought out. Once it was made, we would not withdraw it. But we then would also be very thoughtful about trying to make sure that protesters could protest in appropriate ways without shutting down the ability of the speaker to be heard.
Yeah, I think
Sure, go ahead.
that's more or less, that's the right approach. I think there's a big difference between somebody that's invited to give an honorary lecture and being invited by the president of Princeton, let's say, versus somebody who's being invited by the Middle Eastern Studies Department. And most campuses have a very liberal policy when it comes to student groups or academic departments being able to invite who they want. And I think that's very important. That's part of what makes the university vibrant. I think the hard cases, there's a case of Mark Youngin, who's a member of the AfD, the kind of right-wing party in Germany, being invited to Bard College, and an argument over whether he should have been given a platform at a time when hate speech is on the rise. And I defended it on the basis that I thought the argument to hear him out. This is a conference about fascism. It was an academic conference. They're having a lot of people in the room who were prepared and equipped to engage his ideas. They put him up on stage with Ian Baruma as a foil. And I think that's the right way to engage difficult ideas, and we need to continue to do it.
Yes, ma'am, you had a question.
Yeah, I have a question. It comes to, actually, what is the definition of speech? Because speech has become, when we grew up, speech was talking. Speech is now Snapchatting, Instagram, and everything else. And I think particularly, John, I have a daughter at Deerfield, so I'm very familiar with Massachusetts and laws in Massachusetts, and they're very difficult. Yeah. And so, what is speech in the sense that when you're talking about microaggression, anything that is a Snapchat that's sent around then becomes very, very complicated. Yeah. And I know that they're all over that, and I'm sure you're all over that as well. And speech is no longer what speech used to be to probably most people in this room.
Certainly the idea of digital media in a broad sense has exploded this problem in really complicated ways. And one is particularly for adolescents whose brains are not fully formed and who suffer from something called the disinhibition effect, which is that you are less inhibited when you have a screen between you and the other person. So I might say something that was very cautious here. I'm being recorded. There are a whole lot of you here and so forth. I will be cautious in my language. Were I to be typing on here, much less cautious. That's true of adults and kids alike. And part of the problem, of course, is then it's recorded forever and is shared very broadly and does, I think, define kids. So to my mind, that puts a lot of pressure on those of us who are educators and parents on getting it right early to help kids understand the consequences of it. I go back also to the definitions of some of these related topics like hazing, harassment, and bullying. That's where these cases become so tricky in Massachusetts in particular, where you superimpose the digital on these hazing, harassment, and bullying kinds of cases. And those are ones where, as a school, we're not very well equipped to handle them. They're legal cases sort of that happen on our campus. Sexual assault being another example of it, where we actually have to bring in outside experts because as educators, we need to, it's not what we do.
I think there's someone over here that has a mic. Okay, thank you. Go.
Thank you. So, wow, my mind is reeling. I mean, there are so many questions, and I want to thank you for all of your views and authentic thoughts on the topic. I don't even know where to begin. I'm from France originally, went to Oberlin College, that bastion of snowflakes and liberal thinking, and I have millennial daughters, so I've had these conversations. This conversation in France at university level would never happen. You know, there's no such thing as safe space there. And I don't quite understand it. My view is, in the classroom, there's no intellectual safe space. But American colleges are very different than French universities because kids live there. So they ought, to your point, have to have a safe space when they're not in the classroom. But my question is really about microaggression. I view microaggressions as a death of 1,000 cuts, to the point that they become macroaggressions. You know, as a French woman, I hate that expression. It happens to me at work all the time. Oh, pardon my French. I view that as a freaking slight. Just because you can't speak English, do not blame it on the French. But, you know, at what point, yeah, you said once, it's innocent. You say it 10 times when you know I'm French, that becomes a macroaggression. So I'd like your thoughts on that.
We actually are clear in our policies. We say under most circumstances, a microaggression is not going to be a violation of policy. But if it is a microaggression that is repeated to the point that it literally creates a hostile environment, it can become a violation of a policy. Now, we would not say that it is a violation of a policy to microaggress someone because they're French. It would have to be over a legally protected category in the United States, something, a legally protected
National
category
origin.
of identity.
National
Oh,
origin.
national origin. Oh, you're right. It would be. I just that was a microaggression right there.
What's your policy on macroaggressions?
Right. My
Don't do
apologies,
them.
I totally blew that one. National origin is a protected category. But yes, hostile environment, you know, this is what happens in sexual harassment at times. It's just a series of very small, repeated things that end up having an impact over a period of time. So it can happen that way.
All right, so who should we go to next?
Just one more here and then we'll go back.
Okay, over here.
I've enjoyed the speech very much. The discussion has been great. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal, maybe an editorial, maybe an article, maybe in the last year, about the last 3 or 4 decades trends on university campuses to become incredibly liberal. Most conservative professors, many conservative professors have been driven out. And John, you touched on this a little bit, the notion of having conservative students, and it really hasn't been discussed at all in terms of protecting that conservative student and the ability for them to express their ideas and not be suppressed by teachers and by the generally very liberal thinking that happens now on the coast, both in universities and in private schools. And I'm just curious how you think, whether you think there should be some redress to that, how you get more balanced ideas, because we're talking about really focusing on how we protect people as much as possible, but we've sort of left out a lot of people here who maybe don't share the political leanings that generally are predominant on college campuses today.
I raised it because I think it's a serious issue as well. I'm not sure protect is the word I'd use, but I would say I hope that what we do is do a better job educating kids in a broader sense. And I think part of it does go to the question Jason raised about, do we just, those on the left, perceive that all conservatives are dumb or full of hate speech or racist or whatever? The answer is no, and we ought to get over that to a degree. That's, I think an important first step. I do think that I would maybe put it into 2 categories of problems to solve. One is, on our campuses, could we have a greater diversity of ideology in terms of the faculty and people who come and speak, and we just need to get better at that. I think the second one is, how do you support, rather than protect would be the verb I would use, a conservative student coming to your campus? Does that student feel in a classroom that they can say everything that they would like to say politically in a history class, just as an example. I'm a U.S. history teacher. One of the first things I say is, I really hope you'll disagree with me. If you want to know my point of view, I'll tell you. But you're much more likely to get a good grade on a paper if you are coming at it from a different perspective than I am, and you do it really well. If you are just parroting back to me what you think you've heard from me, I promise you, I'm going to push back on that. That's actually, I don't think you're learning at that point. I don't think all teachers do that, but I actually think we do need to do that and do that much more. I absolutely believe that conservative kids at our school and at lots of other schools, I don't want to speak for other schools represented here, but at other schools, self-censor themselves because they feel that they need to get a good grade. That's something we shouldn't have on our campus. I don't think that's protecting, but it is supporting, I think, in a different way.
Yes, ma'am. No, you go ahead.
I think it's me. I was just trying to think through the issue of safety versus respectfulness. It seems to me that what you want is respectful speech in any group. Safety is a bigger promise than I think you can claim. So my curiosity is about what led you to use the word safety. I suggest respectful is more like what we want. So.
Michelle, why did you invent that term?
Well, Jamel, man.
Yeah.
You talk about for your generation, I think, why.
So I think that, so honestly, I think that, so safe spaces is a term that was, I don't know who coined the term, but it's definitely a popular term now. But I think that the fact of the matter is, a lot of the times when people are being disrespectful, they're not respectful of your morals, your values, your identity, that does start to infringe upon your safety because you are no longer safe to be yourself in that space or in front of you. So I think that respectfulness is a really big part of it, and I think that that's really, in a lot of ways, what the root of it is. Definitely be respectful, be considerate, but I feel like to acknowledge the harm that can be done when people are being disrespectful, it is useful to call it a safe space.
Hi.
Yes, go ahead.
So the first thing I want to I would like to comment on, I want to be very careful. I feel like we're conflating, like, political correctness and censorship are two very different things, right? And a conversation about microaggressions, a conversation about people maybe calling things prejudiced or racist or whatever, which you think are not, is not an issue of people actually having their speech censored. And I think that's important to note, partly just because those conversations shouldn't be conflated, but also because all of the language about, for example, calling something out as a microaggression or being bold about, for example, calling a speaker a white supremacist, for example, that's something that comes from a climate in which saying that would be politically incorrect, in which making that statement would be the provocative thing to do. And in fact, even though when all of these issues started to hit the headlines, you could say that the power dynamic had shifted and that there was sort of a very liberal status quo. That is no longer the case, right?
What's the question?
Okay, so the question is, in that vein of trying to be clear about actually what safety means, right? And therefore saying that, yes, you are safe if a speaker comes to talk, and conservative students are also safe even if they're losing the argument. Sort of in the vein of what the woman from France said, is this a matter of rethinking what the university is there for? Because, in fact, if the university is there to make you safe, we're talking about, well, it's uncomfortable to learn. Is the job to make you comfortable? Is the job to develop you as a human being? Or should you be an adult by the time you get to college, and it's really not college's job to raise you anyway?
All right. All right, you put a lot of thoughts out there. If I may, and we'll come back to you if I haven't satisfied this, but maybe Suzanne, we can ask you this. I know your point is, maybe this is something you can help qualify. What does the sensitivity stuff have to do with free speech itself?
Yeah, I don't know. Someone used a phrase, it was actually when we were at Middlebury, that you have to be comfortable enough to be uncomfortable. And I actually think that, that kind of encapsulates something. Like, there has to be a certain kind of baseline of a sense that you have a place on campus, you're physically safe, you're not going to be subject to constant kind of harassment, if that's multiplicity of microaggressions, that you're not considered an oddity, that you have your place on campus. And then once that baseline is established, if something comes along, if Charles Murray comes to Princeton, but I more or less feel okay there, I'm going to protest and get upset, but I'm not going to get violent. I'm not, I can sort of deal with it at a certain level. It's not so undermining to me and my position that I can't take it, that I want to seek to shut him down. So I think, that's how I look at this, that we've got to create this baseline. And it's not there. In a lot of places, it's really not, it's not there. And I think it varies a lot by university, but they, as people have said, they were created for a different generation of students, student demographics. Already there's no single majority population of students in this country. It's not white people. It's not any group that has a majority. That's going to be the case in our country for our population at large within the next couple of decades. So we're educating a very different demographic of students, and I think universities still have a long way to go to get to that point where people are comfortable enough to be uncomfortable. Jamel.
Yeah, I could answer a little bit as well. I think that your point about growing and learning once you get to the college campus is super important. And I think that the university's place is really to foster the best environment for that conflict of ideas as possible. But I think that really what it falls upon is the students who have gotten to college or who are a part of the university community really deciding amongst themselves what kind of community are we going to foster on our campus? What things are we going to allow? What things are we not going to allow? And that's really, so the onus is really on us as students to decide what is our campus going to stand for and what our campus is not going to stand for. The university at a very high level can decide, okay, our university supports these ideals, our university values are these values, but really when it comes to the everyday interactions, it's on us as students to say, we are not going to allow in our community these sorts of things to happen. If they do happen, these are the types of reactions that we're going to have. And that's not to say we're going to silence any one group, but it is to say when students on our campus feel threatened or feel like their voice is being suppressed, they can come together and have discussions on how to make this work for everybody here. Because everybody on campus does have an equal sort of right to say what they need, whatever they want to say, and hold their beliefs. But it's also on us to make sure that it's very, very known the beliefs that we support as a campus and the beliefs that we really don't support as a student body.
John, you wrote the book on this.
Well, this is such an important concept, and I echo a lot of what you'd said, but one thing that's been a surprise to me in interacting with students from whom I've learned a ton in this job is the extent to which sometimes there's a desire to turn to the institution, represented by me, to do the protecting or the work. And I love the way you put it, which is actually, yes, I'm the protector of some values. I need to create the space. I do need it to be a welcoming space for all the students. But after that, it's on you guys, you all, as the students, to do a lot of this work and to make it alive. Because the kinds of things the institution can do is often not that effective. Like trying to make discipline after microaggressions. Yes, you have to at a certain point, but generally speaking, that doesn't work that well. But what you all do can be wildly effective. And I think we are there for that. That's a big part of the learning. And I think part of our job is, in fact, ensuring the students can thrive in a more diverse environment. That's part of the learning that we're trying to accomplish.
If I may ask one thing real quickly, I probably shouldn't because there's so many other questions, but I just want to ask real quickly. Is it part of the university's job, higher ed's job, to combat the tribalism that is tearing our society apart right now, or that many people think is tearing our society apart right now, where people just don't want to associate with one another and reinforce one another's views, that kind of thing?
To the extent that part of our job is to help support students live in a republic like this, the answer is absolutely yes. And to Suzanne's point, just demographically, the world is different, and I actually think it is a skill set to get along with people politically different than you, racially differently than you, across all sorts of difference. So absolutely, that's part of our job.
Let's go to another question.
Two more questions.
Two more questions.
So
Who's got? Okay.
Hi, John.
Hi, Pamela.
So I have a son who just graduated from Andover, who is going to the University of Chicago. So that is an institution whose values about free speech I appreciate. As a parent, I'd become kind of concerned about the way that language was being used, and I worry about the use of safety this way and the use of aggression this way. And I wonder what it does to use those terms, because the things that you describe as a microaggression or as a safe space, I don't have any disagreement with that those things happen and those spaces should exist.
but what we call them is so important. And so the question I have is, what are the possible downsides to framing a safe space in terms of safety? As you said, if you have a safe space, it automatically makes you feel like everything else is unsafe or dangerous, right? Mm-hmm. And then, even if you want to call it a brave space, you need bravery to encounter everything that's not the safe space. And then with microaggressions, obviously, if it's not intentional, how is it aggressive? And then the question that I've always wondered about microaggressions, and then I'll be done, is how do you know when it's not one? If somebody says, that was a microaggression, is there any way of saying, no, that wasn't a microaggression?
Yeah, I will say I very much agree that the language is complicated and problematic. I understand where it comes from, and many of these things actually come out of academic research, and then they sort of migrate into popular conversation. I don't like the term microaggressions myself because I don't think this behavior is aggressive. I think that sort of, it can feel aggressive, but I don't think its intent is aggressive. So it sort of labels it in a way that is complicated. I wish we had better terms for some of these things.
We have time for one more question. But one thing I would ask you, my mom one time, I'll never forget this may not be relevant, but my mom one time, our next door neighbor, I remember she went up to our next door neighbor and asked her how long she'd been pregnant. She wasn't pregnant. Is that a microaggression? No, that's just being stupid. Anyway, let's go to, all right. I realize it's a dumb question. Where's final question over here? Hope it's smarter than my last thoughts there.
Okay, well, obviously very, very interesting conversation. My question is, it's kind of a derivative of what's been talked about. There's been a lot of talk about safe spaces and organizations and groups that have safe spaces. I'd be very interested in each of you, your opinion about this movement at Harvard against single-gender organizations. The institution's taken a very strong stand. It kind of goes into free association, maybe not exactly free speech, but it is related to some of the things you've talked to here. I'm just curious how you feel about that, those organizations being singled out and being basically, punished by the university.
I mean, I know what you're talking about, which is the finals clause. There's now a policy where if you're in a single-sex finals club, you are ineligible for certain benefits that the university can dole out. For example, you can't get recommendations, I think, for the marshal of the roads. You can't hold certain student leadership positions, for example, team captains. And it's a way, they're really trying to push the finals clubs to admit women. And, the argument, I was at a panel where Drew Faust, the president of Harvard, was explaining this to alums, and her argument, they had some data adduced showing that the finals clubs are kind of a locus for sexual harassment and assault on campus, and that statistically, a lot of those incidents occur in connection with the finals clubs. I was actually just talking to someone yesterday who said, that's not true. That data's been disputed. I think it's kind of a tough case, because there are single-sex schools. It's not something we've really gotten into it because it's not a free expression issue per se. But given that there are certain contexts in which single-sex organizations are permitted to exist, it's a private university, so they probably can decide. These powers are within their discretion, but is it the right thing to do? I don't personally have a strong view. I don't know if Michelle, you have clubs on your campus.
We only have co-ed. Our sort of similar analogy to the finals clubs are already co-ed, our eating clubs. And they were forced to become co-ed after a Supreme Court case back in the 1980s, so we got that out of the way. And I don't know enough about the specific circumstances at Harvard, but I do think if we had a situation on the Princeton campus where we, imagine it was fraternities or sororities, where we believed the setting was actually unsafe, that there was significantly different incidents of sexual misconduct, for example, we probably would take steps to address that. We shut down the ability of our students to join fraternities and sororities in their first 2 years. because we were having such a serious problem with hazing incidents and students being taken to the hospital, alcohol incidents and so on. So, you know, I think sometimes those true safety issues, physical safety issues, are decisions that have to be made. I don't really think that's safe spaces in the sense that we're talking about here. So it's a little bit of a different situation, but my sense is that that's more what Harvard was focused on, was that their perception that there was actual risk of harm to students.
Since we've
at the
been,
subway.
so now that since we figured all this out, I guess that means there's nothing else to talk about when we're going to conclude, but I want to thank you all. Thank you, Suzanne, for inviting me to be part of this. It's been an honor. And thank the audience for the great questions and our panelists.
I just want to say just a word of thanks to Jason, our fantastic moderator, to all of the panelists tonight, to Tara Peters for her role in bringing this event together and making it happen, and to Victoria Bilk, who really did an enormous amount of work to bring us all together tonight and pull things off so masterfully with the help of her colleagues, Clarice Rosage Sharif from Penn, and others. So thanks so much for everybody who made this happen.
Thank you.